Well, good morning, my friends, and welcome to I'm I'm looking forward to this talk. I have no idea where it's going to go. It has just been brewing and brewing and brewing, and as I want to just point out to you in the preview from the previous video, this is something I guess I've been working on for a quarter century or more, and I showed you this yesterday. I found this chart that I made back in 2000, which up to that time had brought together all manner of different trajectories as I was trying to discern, which books influenced which and where they were in relation to each other in time, and of course geography. The New Testament, I mean, it's a puzzle. The Bible's a puzzle. We all agree on this. We all get this. We have lived for 2,000 years of Christians interpreting this text and living the interpretation of that text. That's the key here, is the way we live this text. Okay. I think, one of the merits of the approach I'm taking here, the historical approach I'm taking here, is identifying that common core to the Didache is the overturning of economies of exchange, which we find throughout these Didache type passages, as I mentioned, the Sermon on the Mount, Luke's Sermon on the Plain, Luke 6, Matthew 5 through 7. You have it in the actual document known as the Didache, which I follow Milovech on this. I think it's actually quite an early oral tradition, perhaps as early as 50. That would have been used in one type of Jewish Christianity. It has some relationship to the Gospel of Matthew, although scholarship at this point tends to think it's not a literary relationship, but a relationship of the commonness of this oral tradition that we see. We saw it in Paul, Romans 12, 13, 14. We see it again in 1 Peter. So, in other words, there's this common ethical core. And what Paul does, what we see Paul doing in Romans, is having worked out the implications of this non-retributive ethic in terms of theology. That's really what we see going on. The Johannine tradition, of course, does not have any of this, but nevertheless, it has its own way into this through its theology of the cross and its love one another statements, okay? So this common ethical core of reversing economies of exchange, love those that don't love you, pray for those that persecute you, give to them that ask, care for those that spitefully use you, all this common core, this ethical core, all fundamentally relates to suffering. And we need to do a talk here soon on this fact. The gospel doesn't eliminate suffering. We need to understand this. The goal of the Christian gospel is not to eliminate suffering. That will not happen until, as we say, the Lord returns, however you want to understand that, okay? The gospel doesn't eliminate suffering. What it does is it teaches us that all life is about suffering, and it's how we suffer. It's all about how we suffer. That's what the gospel's about. That's what this early ethical piece that Jesus inserted into the human condition that's going to bust everything apart, all economies of exchange apart. Now, when you come to the question of early Christian history, and I know that most of you have never, ever, ever, ever done this kind of work, and it's probably not of interest to a lot of you, and that's okay too. Here's the thing. When bearing witness to Jesus, you don't need to learn everything I learned. You don't need to learn Greek. You don't need to learn Hebrew. You don't need to learn form criticism, redaction criticism, text criticism, this, that, or the other. You don't need to learn any of that. You don't need to learn any of that. You can discern for yourself whether a text is revelatory or whether it's not. And that's the reason I put up the diagram here in the group. You'll remember the three voices the victim of myth, the victim in travail, and the forgiving victim. And they all have a relationship to sacred violence, that is the connection of God with violence. And of course, as a mimetic theorist would argue, it's just the way humans connect their violence and they call it God. Okay, so it's a false transcendence. That's all we're looking for in any given text. How is this text oriented to sacred violence? Does it break it apart? That's gospel. Does it tie it together? That's myth. Or do we see it in travail? How do we see any given text in the Bible, and for that matter, anywhere? One hermeneutic across the board can be applied. One hermeneutic. Which voice is speaking? You don't need to be a rocket scientist to know this. All of you that have been with me for at least 6 months, or have read The Jesus-Driven Life, or have watched some of my videos where I deal with atonement and sacrifice and Rene Girard, or have read my little book on mimetic theory, all of you know this. If all you had was that little chart, you could read Scripture and follow Jesus. It's all you need. If you were going to be like, I'm going to sit down and read my Bible kind of person. But there's a larger piece to this. It's a bigger piece. It's kind of a more important piece, and that's the other chart that I put up that I began elaborating on first in a post on Facebook, and then I inserted that into the Jesus-Driven Life second edition, and that's the fourfold Christologized Wesleyan quadrilateral seen through the lens of a theology of the cross. And I have stressed this over and over and over again. I want to give you a couple of examples, because one of the things that we're going to do here today is, remember, you have Scripture, reason, tradition, experience. Scripture's the textual Jesus, reason's the historical Jesus, tradition's the ecclesial Jesus, experience is the risen Jesus, okay, the experience of Christ in the church, in the community, or just in life. Each of these plays a checks and balances kind of role with all the other three, okay? And they're all four necessary now. Now, prior to the rise of modern criticism, you only had the first three. But that's not essentially true either, because we already see critical thinking being applied in the early church to the biblical text by people like Origen and Tatian. We already see questions about the authenticity of the text, finding the best Greek text, or the best, underlying text. We see all of these emergent critical principles even in the early church, as early as the 180s, 190s, 200s. One of the things to keep in mind is that the church has, by and large, become bloated in one of the three areas. I would say this: the charismatic movement is totally bloated on the risen Jesus side. The progressive Christians are totally bloated on the historical Jesus side. The Roman Catholics and the Orthodox are totally bloated on the ecclesial Jesus side. And it's difficult to say that there's much attention paid to the textual Jesus in Christendom. So I would have a hard time saying who's bloated there. Maybe that's where we need to do a lot of work. But at any rate, when we come to this business of the history of the New Testament, let's establish something right up front. Here we go. You ready for this? Does any of this matter for faith? And the answer is no. Historical reconstruction cannot be the place upon which faith is grounded, because history is reconstruction. So, for example, our view of history, our view of what happened in space and time is constantly changing. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, after World War II, scholars had a specific way of looking at Judaism, post the modernist scholars in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had this very kind of standardized way of looking at ancient Judaism and then trying to fit Jesus and the church into that. And we see a lot of that influence in the Strachan-Billerbeck commentary. We see it in the other tool, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's reflected there. It's reflected in the first edition of the 4 volumes of Schur's History of the Jewish People. It's reflected in books written prior to that time that are engaged with ancient Judaism. So, for example, George Foot Moore's 3 volumes on Judaism. This paradigm, this way of viewing Judaism, changed dramatically after World War II. And it changed dramatically again in the 80s with the work of James Charlesworth on the Pseudepigrapha. And it changed dramatically again in the 90s with all the emerging work on Samaritanism, as well as Apocalyptic Judaism, the work of Gabriele Boccaccini and the fellows of the Enoch Seminar. So our views are constantly changing about what life is like on the ground in the ancient world at any given time and place. And of course, all these new tools that have come into play, sociological tools in particular, a lot of them really misused. You got to understand something about the way people, the so-called PhDs and academics out there use these tools. A lot of them, folks, they'll take a tool, pick a discipline, a sociological tool, pick a discipline, and they'll read an ancient text in terms of a modern tool. That's not helpful. The question is, how do you read an ancient text in terms of itself? That's always the key question. And so you have to temper a lot of this sociological stuff, which the sociological analysis, the tools that are used, there's a lot of implicit political assumptions in these tools, folks. Okay? Like democracy's good. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We have yet to see it. In America, it appears to be a failed experiment. It was a failed experiment in Greece long ago. Maybe it's not good. Maybe there's something beyond democracy. Maybe democracy is the best we got. But when it's implicit in a tool that is then applied to the New Testament, that's going to skew the interpretation of the text. You see what I'm saying? Hope so. Okay. So we want to be really aware and cognizant of our own self and our own tapes and everything that we think we know. Because whenever we go back to these texts, listen very carefully, because it's going to be true at every level. We are presenting, in a sense, projections of ourselves. All scholarly work is, in one sense, a projection of the writer. Now, that doesn't mean that work isn't pushing towards something that can that you can lay a foundation on in terms of scholarly reconstruction. But let's just take something very simple. What year did Jesus die, 30 or 33? There are 2 views. The Gospels themselves seem to present a conundrum on what day Jesus died on. When the cleansing of the temple happened, beginning or end of the ministry. I mean, there's all these questions that can get raised. And you have to understand that answering them doesn't provide you with faith. It simply provides you with the ability to engage with the academy and all of the work they're doing. That's what it does. That's what I've been seeking to help you do. Now, some have made the mistake of thinking that by leaving evangelicalism and reading, just going out and reading these authors, now they're going to find truth. No. And this is the problem with progressive Christianity. It has bought lock, stock, and barrel into the Enlightenment. And that's bloated out there on the historical Jesus end. Christian Jesus. They can't. And that's why the progressive Christian will include there. We've got a little revelation in Muhammad and some in the world, and the birds there, and the crows, and the trees, and this literature, and that ancient mystic, and this charismatic, and no revelations everywhere. There's no Christological focus whatsoever in progressive Christianity. None. They can't afford to do that, because if they did that, they would have to follow Jesus. Now, when we're reconstructing history, scholars are going to use different tools to establish different theses. Let's just start with the basics. Let's start with the earliest physical literature we have. And that's Paul's letters. Up until Campbell, the assumption was that the Thessalonian letters were written, in and around the time of Corinthians and Romans, and either before or after Galatians, but they were Pauline letters there. And one thing that happened in Pauline scholarship, of course, was scholars noticed that 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are really, really different than Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Romans. And so they questioned the authenticity of those letters. And then you had all these interminable debates about, is 1st Thessalonians authentic? Is 2nd Thessalonians authentic? And so you had this people that said they're both authentic. You had the group that said 1st Thessalonians is authentic, 2nd Thessalonians isn't. And you had the group that said neither one's authentic. And the minority, but still. And that's been the case forever. When Doug Campbell came along in his Framing Paul a few years ago and was able to make a very good case that really doesn't contradict that's done in the Thessalonian literature, for example, by Malabé and others, doesn't contradict it, frames it within the context of 41, the Caligula crisis, the same crisis that would produce the Passion narrative in Jerusalem, produce the first letters of Christendom. And by placing them in 41, and Campbell doesn't make hay of this at all, and I've talked with Doug about my work here, and we'll see down the road how much he approves. But what I've noticed, what I've said is, by gosh, you can have the 1st and Thessalonians, 2nd Thessalonians be authentic in 41, and you can have these other letters, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, the Corinthian correspondence, etc., be authentic as well in the 50, 51, 52 era. But that would also indicate that Paul's made a break, because they're substantively different. And if you do that, you ask the question, well, where's the break between the Thessalonian correspondence and, say, the next potential major letter that's written, like Ephesians? Take Ephesians. And you look at the eschatology, just the eschatology, that is, how is this thing playing out? And it's totally different. The eschatology of the Thessalonian letters is right in line with Second Temple Hanukkah eschatology. It's right there. And there's nothing in the Thessalonian correspondence that at all would seem to indicate that Paul's out of step with the Peter-James tradition yet. But 8, 9 years later, a decade later, things are very different. Paul's changed. And we can examine the eschatology of, say, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 or 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which takes the Hanukkah eschatology, Paul's Hanukkah literature, the Thessalonian letters. You see what I'm saying? if we can account for this break, what we see is Paul moving away from sacred violence, don't we? We certainly do. You've over. This is worth the Thessalonian letters and what you know about Second Temple Jewish eschatology. And if you want to learn more, read more about it. There's lots of great stuff out there. And then you can see how this Second Temple Jewish eschatology influenced the early church and where there's this break from it. It's this break that I'm going to suggest to you has never been properly done by Christendom as a whole, that the gospel is moving us toward. Now, let me begin by saying again, does this historical reconstruction I'm about to share with you matter for your faith? No. Okay, and you'll notice if you have I printed out a copy of that text I put up as a post in the previous post announcing this talk. If you have it in front of you, you'll notice that there are a fair amount of question marks on here. There are decisions I still have to make on how I'm seeing things. But I want to tell you what's important about this particular text. It's the first time in 16 years I am going to shift my paradigm. And I'm intentionally shifting it here because it's starting to make more sense. And that's instead of arguing that Luke is rewriting Matthew and Mark. I'm now working with Matthew is rewriting Luke and Mark. That is, I'm placing Matthew last in the synoptic chain. So I'm arguing, I'm still with Mark and priority. Okay, I'm still going to use Mark and priority. And I know there's a lot of questions about that too. Look, when you got like 90% of your New Testament scholars use Mark and priority, and then you got 10% out here going, there's all these problems still have to be answered about it. It's not settled. As long as you acknowledge it's not settled, which I'm doing, then you can use it carefully. Mark wrote first, that's it, story, boom. As though it's settled when it's not. It really isn't settled. And the other thing you need to know is that the Jesus tradition, often, for example, in so-called Q, that's the common material that Luke and Matthew share that scholars think was an actual physical source, that we just don't seem to have anymore. No. Wonder why, because it never existed. But at any rate, you have this common material. And they know that Luke will often preserve the more original form of the saying with regard to the historical Jesus, and that Matthew tends to be editorialized. So, for example, Luke records in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, the tokoi, the holy tokoi. Matthew's turned that into blessed are the poor in pneumati, blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, is Matthew stripping the economics out of Luke? Not necessarily, because often the poor in spirit are the physically poor, the economically poor. But Matthew's also tying this back into the Jewish scriptures with reference to the Aniyim, the impoverished of the land, as the Essenes would see themselves, and marginalized groups would want to see themselves as, we're the poor. Are they saying the same thing? Basically the same way, yes. But we do see at that point that Matthew could have edited Luke. Now, I have so many questions. You have to understand this. I mean, it makes sense to me that there's so much of Matthew that Luke edited, but the most difficult thing for me in all of the questions I have about and have had over these last 16 years that I've been using Luke in posteriority, that is, Luke wrote last, of the synoptic writers. The difficulty for me has been trying to account for why Luke would so boulderize an incredibly structured text like Matthew's gospel, which is, I mean, it's not that Luke's text isn't structured. It is. But Matthew's text has an elegance in a lot of ways that Luke doesn't possess. So, for example, you take just the Sermon on the Mount. When you go to analyze this structurally, and I think a Goulder makes a nice case that each of the Beatitudes is summarized in chiastic fashion, moving backwards through the sermon. I think that there's a real merit to seeing the Sermon on the Mount this way, so that the sermon is exegeting itself. Who are the poor in spirit? Boom, you go back to the last part of chapter 7. You know, they're the ones who are accepted because they're not just hearers, they're doers. They're the ones that build on the firm foundation. They're the ones that don't judge, this kind of stuff. You have this chiastic structure in Goulder's work. Now, let's begin with this particular view of the early church, because I want to apply a tool that has not been ever applied before to the development of Christian history. To my knowledge, I will be the first person to apply mimetic theory to the discipline of New Testament chronology. And that's all I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to ask is this. Let's assume for the moment that Campbell is correct, and there is a break that is made between 41 and 48, 49, 50 for Paul, certainly by Antioch. And again, Antioch's date between 48 and 50. It's different scholars, okay? For convenience sake, I place it in 48 because at this point, I think there's just not enough evidence to be able to say anything hardcore anywhere about any of this. There's still a lot up in the air, just for convenience sake. I would be happy to change my mind if somebody was able to come out and firm this up a bit. But right now, 48 is kind of the earliest possible date for Antioch, okay? Prior to that, there are a couple of significant things that occur. The first, of course, is Paul's first 2 letters written during the Caligula crisis, and Geert Tyson's suggestion in his book, The Gospels in Context, that the Passion narrative is also written at this time. That is, in Jerusalem, at this time, part of the Caligula crisis is not simply that Caligula wants to put a statue of himself in the temple. It's also the fact that Pilate gets recalled, and there's no Roman procurator overseeing Jerusalem at this point, okay? Now, the one observation, and I think it's Tyson that has made this, could be somebody else, is that whenever there's a Roman procurator absent from Jerusalem, that is, they get recalled, that's when the persecution of the Christians happens by the Jewish authorities. And so we see this specifically here at this time in 41. And James, the Zebedee brother, one of the great 3 pillars, is martyred. Kind of the first, I mean, Stephen, of course, is martyred in the book of Acts, but Stephen's a Hellenistic Jew, okay? And his martyrdom is not really going to affect Jewish Christianity that is Galilean-oriented or Pharisaic or Essene-oriented. It's only going to affect the Hellenistic Jews. James would be the first martyr of Jewish Christianity, and he's one of the great 3, the big 3, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, right? Up on the mountain together, talking together, doing this together. The 3 good, bam, there's one down, bam, 41. James's martyrdom now is going to cause the early church to reflect on this exact same phenomenon that occurred to their Lord, and they're going to begin putting together the Passion narrative. Because the Passion narrative now is not simply about Jesus, but it's going to function as a model for these early Christians. Again, remember, This model that's being formed in this, that now will eventuate in the Gospels in about 30 years, right? It begins with the Passion. That's the first piece of the story that's narrated that the Christian then has as a model for imitation. Okay, and now we have James as kind of the first recapitulation of the originary martyr for Jerusalem Christianity, even though Stephen has been in that sense the proto-martyr in the book of Acts. Everybody goes, oh, look, Stephen's the first martyr. Only for a certain segment of Christianity would that have been true. So now we have this death of James in 41, and the Caligula crisis. Paul reflects on this in the First Thessalonians letter. And of course, in the Second Thessalonians letter, where he's talking about the Antichrist, he's talking about Caligula putting the abomination of desolation, his statue, right there in the temple. I mean, this is it's a potential recurrence of this Maccabean crisis, isn't it? You know, where Antiochus Epiphanes comes in and slaughters a pig on the altar in 167 BCE. I mean, we're coming close, aren't we? Caligula's going to erect a statue of himself. I mean, this could be the end. Bam, this could be it. But he dies, and it doesn't happen. That apocalyptic moment does not happen. It kind of fades away. But it produced the Passion narrative and First and Second Thessalonians. If you have the chart in front of you, you'll note that the second thing I have on here is that the early church, and this is a supposition, it's not something I can prove, but it seems to me, based upon all the paranetic or exhortatory or ethical material of the letters that we find in Paul's letters in particular, but the other New Testament letters as well, that there are Didache traditions developing. That is, each local church or group of churches is forming a particular Didache, and that Didache, folks, is Jewish. You have to think in terms of Jewishness. This Didache has nothing to do with doctrine. This is not a confession of faith. It is not a creed. The early church wasn't thinking in that direction. They were more concerned about how life was lived, how life. And Didache for a Jew involves halakha. Halakha has to do with how a particular injunction, prohibition, or ritual is to be interpreted. How do we interpret, for example, Moses said you can get a writ of divorce. How do we interpret that, Jesus? What's your halakha? Because some of our teachers say you can get a writ of divorce for burning toast. Others say you can only get a writ of divorce when your spouse commits adultery. What do you say? What's your halakha on this? What's your legal interpretation of this text? Moses gives us the right to get a bill of divorce. Jesus says, look, you people got it wrong. Moses may have been right to give you the bill of divorce, but you were wrong in the first place. Therefore, the bill of divorce thing is wrong, because in the beginning, God made them one, male and female. Bam, there they are together. They're one. No divorce here in this text, right? And that text is earlier than the text you're citing, right? That's Jesus' logic. That's his halakha. And you find Paul in his letters aware that he will only occasionally say, I have a halakha from the Lord on this. But if you go look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for example, Paul says, I don't have a halakha from the Lord on this. This is my halakha. This is my interpretation of how to do the whole married virgin thing. This is my halakha. I don't have a word from the Lord on this. A saying from the Lord. Okay? I'm have to give you my halakha. So these instructional pieces, and they again, the Didache is the only one that gets written down as such. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist in oral format. And I think this is the great merit of the work of Aaron Milovich on the Didache, is to show that it is meant to be orally heard and memorized. There's an orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y, or an orality that creates an orality, A-U-R-A-L-I-T-Y, So that the hearers, of course, we're dealing with cultures that literacy rate 4 or 5%, 6% maybe. So people don't read, so they learn, they memorize this thing, and they would have memorized these whole chunks, folks, of Didache in the early church. I went and memorized the Sermon on the Mount as an 18, 19-year-old Christian. King James, but I memorized it. You know, it took me about a month, but we just was with a family, and that was their big thing, Bible memory. And geez, I memorized Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. I memorized slew of Psalms, chunks of Isaiah, whole portions of the Gospels, King James. Still stuck in my head. But it's there. You know, if I was ever on a desert island, at least I have this. Nevertheless, these Didache traditions have to be developing in the 40s, because we certainly see in 41 Paul rendering certain judgments, halakhic judgments in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, don't we? Right? And we see him rendering another one again in 2 Thessalonians 3, where he says, if a person is part of your community and they're not out there working, don't feed them. This, by the way, was a major problem in the early church. It's addressed in the Didache about prophets that come to stay more than 1 or 2 days, or prophets that ask for money. That was a challenge to the early church, was people that were on the dole in the Christian church. They used the church to take care of them. And it seems to me that this is not something that modern Christendom takes into account very well. But we can talk about that another day. But I do find it fascinating. There's a great line in the Didache quoting what appears to be a saying, either an agrapha from Jesus or from the apostolic tradition or somewhere, but because it's not given a direct reference, but it's given as a quote: "Let your alms sweat in your hands before you give them." In other words, hold on to them and make sure when you give them, they're given for the right reason to the right person. Don't throw them away. Don't just give money to people, you know. And that's such a different thing from give to the one who asks you, from the one who would borrow from you, you know, isn't it? So you already see these kinds of halakhic judgments being rendered. How are we going to interpret these sayings? And that's what a Didache is. It's a series of halakhic judgments. We already mentioned yesterday in the Didache chapter 6, there's the halakhic judgment: abstain from meat offered to idols, which is an offering to dead gods. It's idolatry. You know, that tells us that this document is not Pauline, Paul influenced, or anything else, because in Corinthians and Romans, Paul says it doesn't really matter about idol meat. The gods are dead. They're not alive. They're just dead. They're not idols. Whereas for the Didache author, even though the gods are dead, that's precisely the problem, is they have this influence, even, you see. But for Paul, it doesn't really matter. But again, for Paul, you know, if eating meat bothers your brother or sister, you know, don't do it with them present. The Didache is just don't do it at all. It's idolatry. All right. So we have these Didache traditions developing. We can see this common single piece of this tradition in the bless, do not curse, do not retaliate, that again we found in Luke, we found in Matthew, we found in Paul, we find in 1 Peter. I think that piece is very significant. Okay, so it's from that I really do think that Paul's going to begin to sort out everything theologically after that, and he becomes aware of what grace is. I mean, you don't have a lot about grace in the Thessalonian letters because Paul's still embedded in an economy of exchange. It's only when he realizes, you know, bless those that curse you. We cursed God. God blessed us. Pray for those that persecute you. I persecuted Jesus. He prayed for me. Stephen prayed for me. All this kind of stuff that you have to do theologically before you can go, well, this means God's different. And then we see Paul working that out in the great letters. Again, 48, for convenience sake, the incident in Antioch. 50, Paul's prison letters. Again, totally hypothetical, but I think that there is, or there at least needs to be, some kind of a meeting between Paul and the Johannine community. It's, I go back and forth on this. Again, it's very, very important to hold historical hypotheses lightly. Okay, so you can change them when you have more evidence one way or the other. Yes, you have a working hypothesis. Perhaps your working hypothesis right now is the standard two-source theory, Mark and Q, when it comes to the synoptics. That's fine. It's a working hypothesis. It's not history. It's not real. It's just a working hypothesis. And it's very important to keep all of your working hypotheses held lightly, because they'll change depending upon the evidence that you accumulate over time. One of the reasons it's taken Robert Mueller so long to do this investigation, evidence keeps appearing and changing the way the narrative is going to be structured. It's the same thing with scholarly investigation over time. I mean, you go take any discipline, I don't care which one it is, pick Marcion studies. Talk about a revision of just about everything Marcionite in the last 10 years. In other words, you could almost ignore everything said about Marcion prior to 2010 and have a much better picture of Marcion. I mean, that discipline is, it's totally different than it was even a decade ago. Another would be Samaritanism. Samaritan studies have blossomed in the last 20 years. You could almost say anything written prior to, I don't know, 1980 on Samaritanism would be, I'll go 70, because there were some good studies written in the 70s. Yeah, John Wick Bowman and McDonald and others. So prior to 1970, you could almost ignore everything written about Samaritanism. And you see, you can't do that with theology, of course. You're not free to go, oh, only modern theology is great. No. I'm only talking about history here. Okay, so I think there has to be that encounter. Then you have Paul's 7 letters, as Campbell says, in that little 20-month span. Now, I think that we have to date 1 Peter, James, and Jude in the 50s. Jude, I couldn't give you any specific reason other than just there's this gut instinct about this letter. It is so archaic and so Henochic. I mean, so embedded in Henochic thinking. It quotes First Enoch people and the Assumption of Moses. And by the way, the entire letter of Jude can be found, I mean, minus the superscription and the introduction and the quotations from the pseudepigrapha, can be found in 2 Peter chapter 3. The writer of 2 Peter chapter 3 has given us a cleaned up letter of Jude right there. It's there. It's all there. Just cleaned up. Take the apocryphal stuff out because that's questionable. Remove the inscription and the superscription, and there it is. 2 Peter, of course, would have been written in, from my perspective, 60, 70 years later that it's doing this. And it perhaps could be because Jude is not a known document in the early church, because there's the desire to make it, it's apostolic, but we got to take the stuff out that's not going to work, for our contemporaries kind of thinking. But at any rate, it's an indication that this writer in 120, as a quote, a Petrine disciple, is bringing in now this kind of thinking again. There it is. Let's just bring in this thinking. That's why when you read 2 Peter, you think it sounds a lot like Jude and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. That's why all the Schofield references do that. Those back and forth between each other there. Because they are. It's that Second Temple worldview. 1 Peter reflects that as well. There's the question in chapter 3, whether the Enho Kai, with reference to Jesus going down, into the depths? Is it Jesus that's going down into the depths that's going to redeem those in Hades? Or is it Enhokai-Enik? You know, what are we dealing with here? And I have the Didache. I don't believe it's actually written here, and so I would need to make a note of that. But it's certainly it's being put together. It's formed, and it's now being used, or an earlier edition of this is sprung into being. It's being used in the catechetical process. I see real merit in a catechetical process in the early church, and I think that one of the things that's going to happen is when you realize that outside really of Romans 12, 13, and 14, as I'm looking at these other Pauline texts in particular, there's nothing that looks like a Didache until you get to Romans 12, 13, and 14, and then it looks like you have a Didache there. And I'm working on this still, but it seems to me that could be Paul's Didache. What's really important about this thought is that this may, of course, now be the first written piece we have of what a Didache looks like, what scholars call the paranetic or ethical sections. But what if, in fact, we're dealing here with Paul's admonition to Rome to adopt his Didache? And by adopting his Didache, the crisis between Gentile and Jewish believers being together, eating together, would be alleviated. I think that's certainly possible. Whereas these other Didaches, like our Didache, don't eat meat offered to idols, raises the question of can we eat with Gentiles, goes back to Antioch. In other words, I see the whole of this post 41 era, all oriented around the question of table fellowship. It's all oriented this way. It's Eucharistically oriented. Can Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians share in one bread? Or is that a non-kosher meal? And if so, how can they do it? How can they halakhically do it so that it works with the law? That's the big question. Because I think Edwards' thesis has merit with regard to Luke using the Hebrew Gospels. You have to have the Hebrew Gospel being produced at some point prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Shortly thereafter, I'm not sure, because all we can do is we really can't even reconstruct it. I don't think there's a reconstruction of it yet. But we would have to certainly date it. I think prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, one, because it is written in Hebrew, and that is the language of the elite. I find it fascinating, remembering that the Hebrew Gospel is going to reflect a certain portion or aspect of Jewish Christianity, and where do we locate it? Matthew's Gospel, written in Antioch, I think, good support for that, reflecting the post-48 Antioch crisis. Matthew's Gospel is bringing Jesus back into line with the law, with Moses. We see he already does that in the birth narrative, remember? Jesus-Moses parallelism there. But it's a good parallelism, and he says in Matthew 5:17, think not that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill them. And then you have the next three verses where, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, and you sit and you're going, holy shit. You know, I thought we were free. Paul says we're free from the law. Now you got Jesus and Matthew saying, I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets, and if you want to be righteous, you got to fulfill them too. Well, Matthew is saying that. Matthew's Jesus is saying that. Matthew is bringing Jesus into line with a particular way of thinking. That's what all the gospel writers did. That's what we do. That's why one of our tasks is to constantly be challenging our own views of Jesus by reading the Gospels, by letting the Gospels and the letters of Paul just absolutely challenge us to continually rethink who we are in relation to Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospel to the Hebrews has that saying, I have come to abolish sacrifice. And I will riff on this down the road because it's an important saying. And it may well go back to the historical Jesus, and if it does, of course, then there's just another bit of evidence that Jesus is anti-sacrificial. It does not make a whole lot of sense for a form of Jewish Christianity, and you have to say Jewish Christianity because it's the Hebrew gospel written in Hebrew for people that read and speak Hebrew, to say I have come to abolish sacrifice is to you just don't see that kind of logic anywhere in early Christianity, do you? In the early church. But here it is in this agrapha, this saying, which I think gives it some weight in terms of authenticity. So now we have, of course, these letters have been produced by Paul and some of the other figures in the 50s. Big letter writing time in the 50s, writing letters all over. 1 Peter, James, who knows? Perhaps Hebrews is written then, perhaps later. I don't have any idea. And you notice Hebrews is not on here. I have no idea where to place Hebrews. I really don't. Hebrews kind of floats in the air for me at this point. And the book of Revelation's not on in here either. I can't be bothered with it. But I do need to put it in there. Both those documents. Okay. You have all these letters being produced. You have Christians learning to follow a particular pattern of what the Christian life looks like. But they're going to be different because they're all going to be related to various halakhic orientations. And who has the right halakha, and and do we see challenges in the early church over halakha? Yes, we do. So Mark's version of divorce, Jesus comes along and says no divorce. Matthew's Jesus turns Jesus into a Shammaiite and says no divorce except for adultery. Presumably some other gospel writer could have turned Jesus into a Hillelite. No divorce except for just about everything, like your wife burning your toast. Well, you could sit and play this game all day long. But the bigger question becomes, when the early church is struggling to understand this Jesus figure and who they're to follow, they create a way of talking about this Christian life and these behaviors, and then they find them in Jesus. Here's what I want to suggest to you. The gospel genre, scholars have had a long time trying to discern what's the gospel genre. Is it like ancient biography? What is it? Dun, 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 dun. And there's okay, you can read the introductions to just about any gospel or any New Testament introduction and do all this. I'm wondering, did it become necessary for the church as a result of the crisis of the collapse of Second Temple Judaism in 66 to 70, and the resultant suffering that occurred, because we also have to think of Nero in Rome and the early Christians. Okay, you have these two sides of the Mediterranean, this massive suffering that Christians are going to undergo, as well as other parts of the Mediterranean, but these two poles. If the story of Jesus didn't become necessary to replace these localized didaches, that is, Martin Hengel, Richard Bauckham in particular, argues that the Gospels were written for a wide audience, not just a local community. They were meant to be read. And is this Mark and life of Jesus meant to be a new didache? Does Luke come along and feel the need not to just have all this narrative, which Mark has, but also to actually import teaching, didache, teaching, into the text? Same thing with Matthew. Does does Luke's Jesus or Mark's Jesus, do they look Jewish enough for Matthew and Matthew's community? Or does he need to make Jesus so that Jesus can be heard by the hearers of his text? The fall of Rome, 70 CE. The latest the Hebrew Gospel can be written is 75 to 80, particularly if Luke is writing in the early 80s, and let's say he has it for a month before he starts editing it. You know, that's silly, but because it would have had to have some provenance, some its use and authority in some church tradition, I think, before Luke is going to use just any old text. Matthew revising Luke. The epistles and the letter, the Gospel of John, I have as last in line. There is, if you follow the development of the gospel tradition, if you start with Mark, Mark seems to reflect a bit of we would call anti-Petrine, anti-Peter bias. We've seen several places. One, of course, the whole question of what constitutes kosher in chapter 7 ends up in the Pauline trajectory, not that which goes into a mouth, but that which comes out defiles a person. That story is included as a major chunk there in the gospel meant that the issue was still alive and well, you know, for the early church. But also you have Peter being called Satan. Peter's betrays Jesus. I mean, the disciples just don't look good in Mark. They don't get anything. They're misunderstanding Jesus all the time. And that same exact sentiment reflected in the last of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, the misunderstanding and an anti-Petrine emphasis, but we'll come back to John here. So Mark starts with that. Now Luke is not anti-Peter, but he's pro-Paul. And so Luke's Gospel is going to thematically have a Pauline view of things. Take the parable of the father and the waiting father in Luke 15. You know, we talk about the son returning and this fatted calf being slaughtered and all this. What you have there is a text about atonement without sacrifice. I mean, the fatted calf is not sacrificed in order to make the friendship right between the father and the son. Fatted calf's sacrificed because the friendship has been established back again. This familial relationship has been established. Then they go sacrifice the cow so they can have a party. That's nonviolent atonement. That's Paul. You're not going to have that kind of thinking in Matthew. Okay? You're not going to have that kind of thinking in Jewish Christianity, certain forms of Jewish Christianity. During this time, Judaism was also being reconstructed under the leadership of Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai, and then I move on to some of the other literature we can get to another time. Here's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to ask, if I go to reconstruct just the basic working New Testament documents, and then of course I think you've always got to move into the post-apostolic literature, because it's contiguous, because the later New Testament documents like the pastorals and the book of Acts, they're written later than or contiguous with other literature we have in the apostolic fathers right there, and then you know, you just carry that on. I'm asking this one question. What's the relation of any given text to sacred violence? That's all I'm asking. Does a text expose sacred violence, separate them? Does a text still justify sacred violence? Or do we see a text that's both moving away from and still being attracted to sacred violence, text and travail? Myth, text and travail, gospel. Myth, text and travail, separated but struggling, still like magnets. Gospel, totally separate. Okay? Text, the myth, the victim of myth is always guilty. The victim in travail, innocent but retributive. Gospel victim, forgiving, reconciliatory. No economies of exchange. So that's why I say, I come to Paul's Thessalonian letters, definitely all kinds of economies of exchange in that letter, you know, from an eschatological scenario where people burn to well, that's enough. We'll leave that at that. And you certainly don't find that in say, Romans 9 through 11, or 1 Corinthians 15. That's gone. So evidently Paul has learned to remove sacred violence from his eschatology. Well, I think you can show that in his atonement theory as well. Is there sacred violence in Mark? No, the two are very cleanly separated. Jesus is very, very clearly an innocent victim. And very, very clearly an innocent victim of legal authorities, okay, both Roman and Jewish. Luke's gospel comes along, and I think in many ways begins to separate sacred violence from the divine in a very Pauline manner in a number of ways, very creatively. One is, obviously, I just gave you the example of the parable of the waiting father as a way of talking about nonviolent atonement in Luke's gospel. But Matthew's gospel is the gospel that tends to bring Jesus back into line now with this Second Temple thinking that we found in the Epistle to Jude and James and 1 Peter. That's part of and the Didache. It's all part of this Jewish Christianity that's still attached to the law, even as it is now. Whether it's related to the temple, whether there's actual sacrifice that continues, minority opinion, it's related to the law. Post 70 CE, again, Judaism is reconstructing. That's its center point, Torah. And so, of course, Jewish Christianity is going to be in that same orbit. It's no longer oriented toward temple now, but toward Torah. And we see Matthew bringing Jesus. So that's why in Matthew you have all these Gehenna sayings and stuff that you don't have in Mark or Luke or John or Paul. Because that Gehenna stuff's important to Second Temple Judaism, and heck, Jerusalem and the temple itself suffered tremendous damage, and there's a lot of anger and pain and hurt and rethinking and where's God and all kinds of questions being raised here as these groups are reconstituting and saying, okay, now we don't have this anymore. Now what? I'll leave it here today. We're at an hour. Hope this has been a little mildly entertaining for you. But that's all I'm trying to do to establish a chronology here is ask, do these writers, where are they, where do we see any given text in relation to sacred violence? Jude is mythic, man. It's right there. It's got the two connected intimately. I mean, as intimately as you could want. Jude, John the Baptist, bam, there's, it's John the Baptist, is the Epistle of Jude, okay? They're connected. Romans, they're totally separated. Matthew, they're still doing this. 1 Peter, they're still doing this. James, I think they're still doing this, but it's much closer. 1 Thessalonians, still connected. You see? That's how I view the New Testament documents. They all are bearing witness to the relation of God to sacred violence when the whole point of the New Testament is to make that separation. The whole point of the gospel, not just, but the whole point of the gospel is to make that separation, that distinction, that God is not violent, God is negative. So that's why I say if you had that little chart at the beginning, the 3 types of victims, and you understand that, and you've got that good theology of the cross, that's where you're starting, and you're willing to recognize the 4 aspects of developing an authentic Christology, textual Jesus, risen Jesus, anybody could read the Bible. I really think they could. It's not rocket science. But we have 2,000 years of garbage to get out of our heads, and we especially have the last 300-400 years of Enlightenment kind of rationalism to get out of our heads as well. That's all we're doing here. When we engage this, all we're doing is we're saying, okay, let's see what happens when we take this gospel view into New Testament chronology. How does it affect how we can say, the things that we say? All right. Well, peace and love, folks. Thanks for letting me share with you today. As you can see, I'm having a gas, man. I hope you be ready for more. We will get back into the birth narratives. We still have some time to go for the preachers that are preaching on these things. And I've also got to get my sermon text for Sunday ready. All right. Peace and love and cheers. Ciao.